ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to These Go to 11. Once again, I'm Nathan Bell. Joining me, as always, Zach Bartles. Zach, what's going on, man?
Man, we're at $991 on the Ted Kluck essay book Kickstarter. That means the next person who funds will bring us over the top to a meaningless number that's more than we set out to get. But still, I mean, it feels symbolic.
That's right. I mean, once you actually reach the mark, aren't all the numbers kind of like meaningless at that point? It's just more, more and more and more.
Well, the beautiful thing, I mean, Ted and I have both done publishing in the traditional kind of advanced paying world, and then we've also done it in the indie world. And it's nice that this time we'll be able to like give Ted a bit of an advance on this indie book. So that's unusual. So nice. God bless Kickstarter and the 8% of everything that they take.
Now tell us a little bit, Zach, about some of the promotional stuff. Do you kind of have some of that information there of the different tiers that people can pledge? I know you can go on Kickstarter and look some of that stuff up, but do you have some of that information there?
Yeah. The highest level was called "You're Our White Knight," which is a reference, of course, to Die Hard. And stupidly, we only made 4 of those available for a $100 Kickstart, and all 4 of them were snatched up right away.
Wow.
And that involved being mentioned in the acknowledgments and everything. But then we've got one that's got being mentioned on the Happy Rant and the Gut Check Pod and Much Made of You, and a bunch of other things to go along with it. And then there's all of them get $30 and up, get a copy of this book signed, a copy of Hello, I Love You signed, which is a book. I think did you do that Crossway or with Moody? It was about adoption, international adoption. Just one of my favorite books, actually. It has kind of a cult following. Nice. And so, there's a bunch. And Gut Check and Happy Rant sticker for everybody, too.
Courtesy of Mission Aware there, right? Mission
Aware somehow wound up horning in and getting mentioned, even though... So what you did was you floated a note to Jeff at Mission Aware that said, "Do you still like us? Yes, no, circle 1." And he didn't circle anything.
We're holding out hope still.
I knew we were on the rocks when I saw that we were back to only having one These Go to 11 page on missionaware.com.
I'll know the relationship's officially over when we don't have any.
I'm looking right now, man. Don't think I'm not looking. Collabs, These Go to 11, right before Gut Check Podcast. There it is. I don't know. I couldn't tell you, man. Okay, well, there it is.
Nice. Oh, man. Well, definitely, want to send that out to our listeners. Get on Kickstarter and look up. What's the name of the book called again?
It's called A Hard Thing on a Beautiful Day and Other Essays.
Nice. So check that out on Kickstarter. Go ahead, and there's a lot of really cool incentives and things that you get for helping out with the Kickstarter. So definitely get on Kickstarter and look for Ted Kluck's new book coming out. And is there kind of a release date for that?
Yeah, July 7, I think.
Okay, July 7. Nice. Zach, this is really kind of cool for us because it has actually been a little while since, you and I are getting back into a rhythm and groove of podcasting, the two of us. But it's been even...
Nathan, I think anyone who's taken a look at you and me and our chalk and white, middle-aged forms knows there's no rhythm or groove involved whatsoever. And our guest today isn't helping matters. I'm looking at a picture of him.
Yeah, pretty lily white.
There's no rhythm or groove, but we are into a routine.
There we go.
Which does sound like it's up our alley.
Oh man. Well, dude, with that there, definitely want to introduce our guest, Stephen Atkerson, author of New Testament Church Dynamics, A Leader's Guide to Biblical Growth and Planting. Stephen, how are you doing today, man?
Well, fairly partly cloudy. How about you guys?
Lovely in Michigan.
Dude, what is Michigan like? Because last week we were chatting it up, and you were like, it's horrible. It is cold and rainy, and
you turn to the corner, it's 67 degrees and sunny today. I had the windows open on the car, the sunroof. Woo! Yeah, life returns to people. It's wonderful.
Nice. Well, Zach, you have Mr. Stephen Atkerson's bio there. So why don't you go ahead and read that? Because I know that you dug far and wide to get that because it's, as we have astutely observed, it's missing from the book. So.
Well, I found it since I've been sitting here. It is.
It's inside somewhere.
Okay.
It's hidden on page 119.
119, like Psalm 1. About the author. After which there's about his organization, and then the gospel.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to read this. All right, Stephen E. Atkerson. Steve serves as pastor teacher of the Southern Baptist Church he started in Atlanta in 1991. I'm not going to mention that I was like 14. Well, in college, he joined First Baptist Church of Atlanta, Charles Stanley, pastor. After graduation, he moved to Birmingham, where he led downtown First Baptist College department, ministering to students at Samford University, including then student Al Mohler. Just a little aside, there's a lot of name dropping in this. He has
I got to get credibility sometimes.
He has an MDiv from Mid-America Baptist Theological Seminary, and while there was part of Bellevue Baptist worship program. Workship program. Mm-hmm. I was listening to Adrian Rogers on the radio today, one of my favorite preachers, actually. Adrian Rogers, pastor. He then ministered 7 years on the pastoral staff of a mid-sized Baptist church. In the late 80s, Steve began working with churches that desire to follow apostolic traditions of church practice. He has transitioned from mega churches to mid-sized churches to Roman villa-sized churches. Married 34 years, he and his late wife, Sandra, have 3 grown children and a growing number of grandchildren. He's author of, what we already said that, we're full circle. And by the way, your dedicatory to your wife, literally, like my wife came into, I have a cigar room in the back of my house where I read, and she's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "This is just like the nicest thing I've ever read." And it made me so sad and so happy for you at the same time. So,
well, thank you, brother. Amen.
Very, very cool. Let's just jump into this. I know we could probably ask you like about the whole journey from how you got from being at these big churches to how you slowly became convinced of some of these practices, but I think the practices themselves are more interesting, even though that would be interesting. I want to get your perspective on some of these things, and I want to do a little like light pushback on some of it, and make things a little interesting. And I'm sure Nathan will jump in here and there. But I discovered you. There was a period of time there where, like every day, multiple times a day, there were these ads on Facebook with Sinatra. I did Church My Way, which made me think of Chris Roseborough and a couple other guys who've kind of referenced that song in terms of, and at one time I was just like, all right, I got to know what this is about. And I clicked it, and I spent like a whole afternoon watching videos of you teach. It really was great stuff. And I immediately emailed you about having you on. These go to 11.
I appreciate that. Amen.
The video I watched first was about the Lord's Supper.
Okay.
And it was a day, we have monthly communion at my church. It was the day before we were going to have communion. And I was like, man, this is some really compelling stuff. There's some stuff that feels a little out there to me because it's so,
new.
Not even new. Like, I mean, it's describing a world that's gone in a way where you're like, maybe it's not. Why can't we do it? And so maybe just if you could give us kind of the brief overview of what you teach in the New Testament Reformation Fellowship about the Lord's Supper and how that teaching differs from what happens in most churches today.
When you look at how the early church, and by that I mostly mean the church in the New Testament, although it's true out in the church history for the next several hundred years, in the New Testament church, you start to see glimpses of how they celebrated the Lord's Supper, and you start to realize, well, it's a whole lot different than what we do. And in short, the early church celebrated the Lord's Supper as an actual supper. It was a true meal, just like there was the Passover feast, so too it was the Lord's feast. the Lord's Supper grew directly out of the Passover, of course. And when Jesus passed the bread and the wine, he didn't separate it from the food in any way. Matthew tells us while they were eating, he passed the bread around. And then in the other Gospels, we find out that either before and then after the meal, he passed at least 2 cups and gave meaning to them. And so you go out into church history and you see the churches celebrating the Lord's Supper in a way that was described as a time of fellowship. When you think about how we do it today, fellowship is the last word that would come to your mind. And then also in Corinthians, for example, the sin in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 11, is that some people were going home hungry from the Lord's Supper. Well, obviously, they had a problem that was completely on a different level than what we do today. I mean, everybody goes hungry today, the way we do it. And so when you look at the New Testament, when you look at early church history, it's obvious the early church celebrated the Lord's Supper as a meal. They had the bread and the wine in the context of the agape, or the love feast. And, you know, that's not even speculative on my part. Scholar after scholar after scholar of every denominational background, the ones that study this, that's what they say. It was an actual meal. And so just from a selfish point of view, I thought, okay, if that's what they did, what are we missing if we don't do that? And what you're missing is a tremendous time of fellowship and edification through fellowship over a meal. I don't mean it to sound too crass, but if the Lord's Supper celebrated as an actual meal every Lord's Day really is the Christian equivalent of the neighborhood bar, where you've got this unstructured time of relaxed fellowship. And so I think one of the things we're missing is a blessing if we don't do it the New Testament way. And when we go to church today, you know, it's a great time of worship. I'm all for worship. Hopefully it's a good time of teaching from the scriptures, and I'm all for that. But it's like when the show's over, and they just turn you out onto the street. Okay, well, now what? Well, the rest of that story is not only are we to worship God in our spirits on the Lord's Day, not only are we to be stimulated in our minds through the message from the scriptures, but also our relationship is to be horizontal with the other people there. And when you have the meal, when you add the meal, that completes the wonderful experience that ought to be normative for all of God's people. So that's the selfish part of it. On the other hand, there's also some forward-looking aspects to the Lord's Supper, and most statements of faith, like the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, says the Lord's Supper has got 2 purposes. It looks backwards to the cross, but it also looks forward to the second coming. And so if you only have the bread and wine at the Lord's Supper, well, of course, we only look backwards to the cross. When you add in the meal, the agape, the fellowship, that's a picture of what's going to happen when Jesus comes back. And what's going to happen is the wedding banquet of the Lamb. And the first time Jesus passed that cup, he said, okay, you guys, drink of it. And then he gives them a reason. And he doesn't say anything about it representing his blood the first time he passes the cup. What he says is, drink of it because I won't drink of it again until I drink it with you in the kingdom of God. And so every time we drink the wine of the Lord's Supper, of course, we remember in the past the blood of Jesus, but we're also to remember the promise of Jesus that he's going to come back and eat it again with us. And so when you have the Messianic banquet in the future, and we have a banquet today, well, what better way to typify a banquet than with a banquet? So we're actually acting out a prayer in this banquet that asks Jesus to come back and eat it again with us. So not only is there the fellowship and edification through fellowship that happens, but there's this weekly reminder of this not only Jesus' death on the cross, but this expectation of the coming of the Lord, something to look forward to. And so it looks to me, Zach and Nathan, like when the early church celebrated the Lord's Supper, it was just that. It was a celebration, not a funeral. And it was more like rehearsal dinner at a wedding in anticipation of the coming wedding the next day. It had a wedding celebratory aspect to it, more so than a funeral aspect. And of course, today, as you well know, we have made it an introspective, individualistic funeral. And I believe we're cheating people if that's all we give them at the Lord's Supper. So we're missing a blessing. And that's the long and the short of it.
Okay.
Now, people say, well, that's not commanded. Well, okay, it's not commanded. But most evangelicals usually want to do things the New Testament way as much as they can. I mean, no particular form of church government is commanded. That's why there's these different forms of government. It's not commanded that we meet on Sunday, but most churches do because that's the pattern. And believers' baptism is a pattern also that we follow. It doesn't say you cannot baptize babies, but the Baptists, for example, want to follow the pattern of only baptizing believers. So I'm arguing for consistency. Well, there's also a pattern of celebrating the Lord's Supper every week as an actual meal. And of all the changes our church has made, of New Testament patterns that aren't typically adopted that we started doing, that one pattern has been the greatest blessing to our church than any other changes we could have made.
I often will joke that the third sacrament for Baptists is that we have potlucks, and you're kind of saying that the potluck ought probably not to be separated from the bread and the cup. We have a number of times. I was a little uncomfortable with this, but a few years ago, we teamed up with a couple other churches, Presbyterian and a Bible Baptist, and we did a Passover Seder meal. Yeah. Which I thought was cool in that we said this is a teaching thing and a fellowship thing. It's not that we're bound to this. And we had, so in the midst of eating dinner, we did have the Lord's Supper. And there is an element, I think, to that where you're being nourished physically. And then there's this thing that, that nourishes the soul in with it. And I really think it's interesting that even though that was, the Last Supper being kind of played out again, there was less of a funeral face and more of the joy of the wedding feast present, because you're sitting next to and across from people and even able to kind of talk and things. I heard Piper once teaching on the Lord's Supper and made quite a good deal out of how small the things are as kind of a significant thing. Like you're not actually walking away full, and that's important because it reminds you that it's not your body that's being fed. You're saying the two things ought to go together.
Well, absolutely. And remember, it's not just any old meal. This is a sacred covenant meal. And so people need to approach this meal with the same dedication that they would church attendance or tithing, if that's what you believe in. And so this is not just in that sense, it's not just a potluck that we've tacked on at the end. This is an integral part of the church gathering. In fact, Zach, as I recall, I think I'm right on this, the only reason ever given in the Bible as to the purpose of a church meeting is to eat the Lord's Supper. And that same reason is given 3 times, first in Acts, I think twice in 1 Corinthians 11. So, I mean, it's so important that when a reason for a church meeting is given, is to eat the Lord's Supper, and they did it as a meal. So, again, it should rise to the level of, boy, this is a non-negotiable. If something's got to go, it's going to be the worship or the teaching, but we're not going to throw over this meal, which is not to say that other stuff is unimportant. Of course it is. But the only reason we're ever given for a church meeting is that meal, to eat. So I think God knew what he was doing. It's clear the apostles set it up that way. Well, where'd they get that crazy idea? Well, it looks like they got it from Jesus. So I, for one, am loath to monkey around with church the way the apostles set it up. And in fact, when you look out in church history, it looks like this meal lasted a couple of 100 years after the New Testament. When it went away was around the time of Constantine. And, they took pagan temples, really, and made them in church buildings. Like if you go to Rome, what's that big thing in Rome? The Pantheon. Only reason it's still standing is because they turned it into a church building. They tore the rest of those things down whenever they could because they had been such a threat to Christianity before that. And so overnight, you got these pagan temples becoming church buildings. And Christians, later centuries, they got kind of weird about church buildings, and they started giving them the significance of the Old Testament temple sanctuary thing, like God's haunting your building, and you don't run in there and you don't shout in there. And some of the early house churches, when people died, they'd leave their homes to the church, and the churches modified it. And sometimes the first thing they did was tile over the bathrooms, because you don't do that in a holy building. And that kind of goes along with the meal. You don't do that in a holy building. It don't go in and it don't come out in a holy building. So that this wrong idea of holiness being disassociated from the covenant meal is I think, crippled us in later history. So backing up, though, even when you look at Old Testament history, eating in the temple complex was a big part of the worship. And if you look at the regulations for the sacrifices, when people brought sacrifices to the priests, of course, the priest got some of it, but in many of those sacrifices, the people who brought them ate the food there in the temple complex too. So that this idea of eating as a part of your worship is very Hebrew as well.
Yeah. Now, I think that Constantine becomes such a convenient kind of bad guy boogeyman. But in your book here, you mentioned that by the time Justin writes his apology, which is mid-2nd century, these two things have already been kind of separated.
They were separated, right? They had, they've got the bread and the wine separated from the meal, and one was in the morning and one was at night. That was the first mistake.
Now that's awfully early in church history. Are you kind of a restorationist in your thinking that the church got off track quite quickly, and we need to kind of get back to something that was lost, well, good grief, almost immediately, if that's the case?
I don't like the Restoration movement because, of course, it's associated with the Church of Christ, the Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and for that matter, the Seventh-day Adventists. But I think you'd have to admit the early church fathers are wretched examples of justification by faith. They seem to have really gotten that foggy in a hurry, which is disconcerting. So, no, I'm not going to deny the true church has ever ceased to exist. Okay. But if I've got to pick between what I clearly see in the New Testament and scholars agree was the case versus a later development of church history, then I think the burden of explanation ought to fall on the guy who wants to deviate from the New Testament pattern instead of from the guy that wants to follow it. So I feel like, as I said before, whatever the reason was they got rid of that meal, and maybe they had great reasons for doing it, it really does need to be a good reason to deviate from the New Testament pattern. And that ought to be the exception and not the rule. So I'm suggesting, just like with Martin Luther, there was a problem there with the theology of the Catholic Church. Well, so many of the reformers they helped us a lot with theology proper, but they just turned Catholic cathedrals into Protestant cathedrals. And they the way they do church went back to Constantine more than in some cases it did to the New Testament. So, I'm not saying the church ever ceased to exist, I'm just saying if everybody that studies it objectively sees that it was a meal in the New Testament, then why in the world wouldn't you want to still do that today? That's my question. And we've got the freedom to do that. I'm not saying it's a sin not to, I wouldn't say infant baptism is a sin either. I would just say it's an error. The New Testament pattern is to baptize believers, and so too the New Testament pattern is to celebrate the Lord's Supper as a meal. And I don't want to miss anything God's got for me in that sense.
Nathan, what do you think on this before we move on to the next section here?
Sure. Yeah, it's been interesting, listening to, you speak on this, Stephen, and I was kind of thinking through this, but one of the things that I was thinking too is, in the New Testament, there was really the one primary day for the gathering of the church, where today there are a lot more church events and functions that happen where the believers can come together and fellowship a little bit more, that I don't think was quite as accessible at that time. I mean, even at that time, the rest of the world was on a 7-day work week, and it was more unique for the believers to take that one day off in order to celebrate worship and be at church. But the other 6 days, they were typically working, where I find myself, thinking about this, and I have a lot more opportunities in my fellowship with believers than I think was available back then. I mean, I know I'm there fellowshipping on Sunday, but I'm also there on Tuesday interacting and fellowshipping at youth group. I'm also, part of small group and, Bible studies. And so for me, there's those opportunities of fellowship that I think have grown over the centuries that I don't think were there at those points. Zach, Stephen, what do you think about that?
Doesn't it say in Acts that they were in each other's homes day by day breaking bread and devoted to the apostles' teaching and prayer?
Knew you were going to put me on the spot like that. I think there's something to be said about that as well. Obviously, since it's in Scripture, but this is the point where I would usually shoot it to Greg. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say I would have to look into that a little bit more to look at that and see that. So I'm just going to defer to my ignorance at this point.
Well, Nathan, when you were talking, I was thinking, a rose by any other name is still a rose. So if a church can accomplish fellowship during the week in a way that wasn't done in the New Testament, oh, that's great, as long as they can get it done. Mm-hmm. But I think, and I'm all for that, I understand that, but I think that theologically, we shouldn't let it go that easy, because we talk about the Lord's Day. It's when we're talking about the Sunday meeting day, when John said he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day in Revelation, the Greek there is completely different than the eschatological phrase, the day of the Lord, which is the big second coming judgment thing. And this strange, unusual Greek construction for John being in the Spirit on the day belonging to the Lord, which most commentators understood to be Sunday, because the day Jesus rose from the dead. Well, that same construction is used of the Lord's Supper. It's a little bit weird the way it's structured. So you got the day belonging to the Lord, and you got the supper belonging to the Lord, eaten on the day that belongs to the Lord. So like these two things are wed together. And I think there's theological significance in that. And the Didache, one of the earliest Christian writings, maybe the earliest, whenever they celebrated the Lord's Supper, they said, Maranatha, which, meant Lord come. And they understood that the second coming the Lord's Supper also had something to do with the second coming, not just Jesus' death on the cross. And so, again, our church only does the Lord's Supper when most of the church is expected to be there. We wouldn't typically do it on a Tuesday night fellowship, because that's less than a group of the whole church. Or church discipline. It's supposed to involve the whole church. You don't just decide with a small group on Tuesday night to do church discipline to get somebody. It's got to be involved with the whole church. And so while fellowships during the week is good, and while small group get-together and dinners are good, I think they should not be a substitute for the main activity, what ought to be the main activity of the gathered assembly corporately on the Lord's Day, which is the Lord's Supper. And in fact, even in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, when you come together as a church, and then he starts talking about the Lord's Supper. So yeah, I mean, I'm all for fellowship all week, and maybe that does solve the problem for most people, but I'd still rather do it the way we clearly see patterned in the New Testament.
Another section of the book is the idea of small churches being a biblical prescription rather than something to get beyond as quickly as we can, or an indicator of a problem. And a nice segue, I think, from the last subject of this is when I think about too big of churches, I always think about those little, I hadn't seen these until about 5-10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, these little pre-wrapped cellophane-covered things that are individual elements for the Lord's Supper. You pull off the layer of cellophane and there's a wafer. You take that, you pull off another layer of cellophane and there's this preservative-filled grape juice. You've come across this, right? Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
I die a little inside whenever I once even declined to take part. I was like, there's just, the symbolism here is just too ironic.
Terrible.
So the notion of a small church, and what was nice was reading this, a lot of what you had come to the conclusion of, my research over the years has also discovered that house churches weren't necessarily, 2 families or 7 people, that these homes could accommodate in their courtyard, the homes of the wealthy people, like someone like Philemon, could accommodate 100, 125 people, an average small church. And I really thought that was, in my mind, reading this book, that was the chapter where the most times I was like, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is beautiful. How did, but I mean, coming from, and God bless these guys. I don't think that you would turn on these guys either and call them heretics, or you wouldn't drop their names in your bio. But how do you come from Adrian Rogers and Charles Stanley to determining that 15 million people isn't the goal?
Well, I think, from being a pastor, I mean, the best place for a tree to hide is in the forest, and so if the pastors don't know everybody in the church, there's a problem. If the church is so big that if somebody is not there, they're not missed, then that's a problem. And so, in as much as we are to shepherd the flock, and it's to be like a family, not like an athletic club, then it needs to be of a manageable size so that the staff, pastors, can keep up with them. And so when you consider the fact that everything in the New Testament that's written to a church is written to a church that met in somebody's home, well, for a fact, it wasn't thousands and thousands of people or even hundreds and hundreds of people. So we start to shoot ourselves in the foot when we get too big. Now, I know Jesus did teach the multitudes, the thousands of people, and that's great for a teaching meeting. So, if Billy Graham wants to rent out when he was alive, if he wanted to rent out the Coliseum,
not now,
that's fine. Or if Bill Gothard wanted to come to town and he used to rent out the Civic Center, thousands of people, that's fine. Okay, how about Bill Gaither wants to come to town and rent out?
I'll take Gaither over Gothard any day. Okay.
Have you noticed the pattern? To have one of these big meetings, your first name's got to be Bill and your last name's got to start with a G. But anyway, here's my point. For worship, for teaching, for evangelism, man, I don't care how big it is. And if you got a guy like Piper and he can draw that many people, or MacArthur, that's fantastic. But don't call that church. Church in the New Testament is small enough you can know everybody there and will fit in somebody's home. Although be it a Roman villa, not a modern home like we think of it. So we're talking, as you said, scores of people, maybe over 100, but not hundreds in the same congregation. And so I think those big meetings do serve a good purpose, and I'm all for them. I just don't think they ought to call that church, because the things the church is supposed to do, they're not doing. There's not the accountability so often. Of course, they're clearly not doing the Lord's Supper as a meal. It's not and if they did, it wouldn't be a family meal. It'd be like going to a cafeteria somewhere with a bunch of people you don't really know. And another aspect of early church meetings was, of course, they did church discipline. Well, you got to know each other if discipline's going to happen. And their meetings, we haven't talked about this, but early church meetings were participatory, where any brother there could get up and speak. Well, that's not going to happen at Bellevue Baptist Church with 14,000 members. It's just not, and nor should it. But it can happen in a small church. There's the opportunity for that to happen. And I would argue another biblical pattern is regarding church government is that you've got elders whose one of their jobs is to build consensus among the congregation over major decisions. Well, that's workable when they know everybody there, but when you're in church with thousands and thousands of your best friends, those lines of relationships don't exist to really build consensus the way it ought to be built. And so they revert from consensus to command in their leadership models, which I think is another, in my opinion, that's a violation of a New Testament pattern too. So the point of all this is, once you get away from the size of a New Testament church and you decide, okay, we're going to violate that pattern, and we're going to get bigger. Well, okay, now all of a sudden it almost forces you to violate other New Testament patterns. And I just don't want to go there. I mean, I've been there. How's that? I've done that. I've seen the good and I've seen the bad. And I'd rather go with the New Testament example.
I'm still reeling from when you said, don't call that church, in reference to MacArthur and Piper. That's a yikes.
Well, I would call it a ministry meeting. It's a ministry of a few gifted people, and I'm all for that. That's great. But, what they do is they turn it upside down. And I don't mean to unduly pick on them, but a huge church, the big show they call church. And then during the week, as maybe Nathan kind of pointed out, you've got these small fellowship groups around, and they don't call those church. They call those ministry, cell meetings, ministry meetings, ministry groups. But it's just the opposite. The small groups really is what is church, and the big show is a ministry meeting. And what ought to be primary and non-negotiable is the small meeting. What ought to be secondary and the first thing to go if you got a problem is that great big meeting. So I think it's just upside down.
Nathan, you have any thoughts on that? Awfully quiet over there.
That's all right. I warned you I was going to be pretty quiet anyway. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's fascinating to hear different perspectives and different points of view on church dynamics and how the church should be run. I had a unique background growing up. I mean, I was a denominational mutt, and so I saw a lot of different ways in which church was done and held, and including the small in-home churches when churches were being planted and started, and moving to hundreds, and even in some case over 1,000 people in a church. And I think the key thread through all of that is, I think you're absolutely right, Stephen. I think in a church of several thousand people, if people are getting lost within the crowd, then I would agree that you can't really call that church. If you're not taking time to get to know one another and fellowship with one another, and you're just you're walking in and almost punching your time card type thing, then yeah, I think you're getting lost in the mix, and that's not really church. But I think even if you're getting the main body of the biblical teaching from someone who is has dedicated their time and life to the scholarly study of God's Word and to shepherding people, and then you're breaking off into your smaller groups, then to me that's still church, because the emphasis of the larger is to promote the smaller, because they know that's where the discipleship and the ministry is going to take place.
Sure. Amen. Well, Adrian Rogers, I heard him say when I was in church here, he said he wasn't smart enough to preach anything besides the Bible. Mm-hmm. But he was smart enough to know not to preach anything besides the Bible. Right? And that's the way I look at church practice. I mean, I've read a lot of those books on church renewal, and, everybody's got this way of doing church and that way of doing church, and they're brilliant and they're creative. And it's like, wow, the Willow Creek model and the Andy Stanley model and all that. But I feel like that about the way Adrian did on preaching. I'm not smart enough to think up a way of doing church that's beyond the Bible, but I do feel like I am smart enough not to try to do something that I don't see in the Bible. And that's the approach I've taken. Right or wrong, I'm not throwing rocks at other people. That's not my purpose. I wrote this book to try to influence church planters to consider doing church a New Testament way instead of some way they've inherited from the denomination. In fact, according to Barna, the typical American church is under 100 people. So most churches in America are small churches and could do most of the things in this book if they were so inclined.
I think one of the bigger dangers, maybe at least equally big, of people kind of being inaccessible to each other, not knowing each other. You reference pastors being kind of spirited away and separated away. Sometimes they even have security, keeping the unwashed man. I'm not going to say his name, but a certain guy with enormous biceps and a teeny little microphone. At one point had people kicked right out of the church for wanting to try to talk to him. And if a pastor can't know his people, I do agree that's, I'm not going to say that's not a church. I'm going to say that's not pastoral ministry. That's maybe you're separating out and you're able to do the episkopos overseer stuff on this huge macro level. But if you're going to call yourself pastor, you got to do the shepherding, which includes knowing people and of course the plurality. I didn't bring up the elder led because I didn't think anything in that was. That's the same sort of stuff you read in most any kind of Reformed Baptist movement or anything. It wasn't too far out from what people are already doing in most churches in our spheres. But what really blew my mind was the figure. I'd never heard this: $2 million to plant the church if you do it with all the bells and whistles and fog and lights and everything. How much easier and would it be if everyone could just say, all right, we're going to start somewhere real small and start a tight-knit community of people following Jesus together.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. And rent a place, ideally, rather than buying it. The problem with house churches in that sense is a modern-day Western house church is too small. And although churches typically do start out in somebody's living room, and I'm all for that, pretty soon you're in a maximum number of people that can fit in there. And if you stop there, I think that's sub-New Testament. So you don't want a mega church, but you don't want a micro church either. So I think there's got to be that commitment to buying or renting a home that's big enough to hold 100 people and the cars that they drive up in, or looking for a place to rent that's suitable, that's got a home-like atmosphere, can accommodate the food, and then, of course, also, big enough for your 100 or so people to meet in. So yeah, it's that happy medium between the two extremes. But if you can keep meeting in an American house and do that, I'm all for it. It's just, but we were doing that here. We were modifying load-bearing walls and tearing out walls, and we were getting 60, 65 people in a house, but then the county came after us because all those people drive up in cars, and they didn't like all the cars on the residential street. Yeah. And so that got us in trouble. I guess that wasn't a problem in the first century so much.
We've had a number of refugee groups meeting in our church building, and one of them was a Nepali group, and they first invited me to come and preach and officiate the Lord's Supper, and I came to a little one-bedroom apartment in this kind of iffy part of town, And I walked in, and there were a pile of shoes there because there were 50 people kind of sitting on their knees, from little tiny kids to old folks. And I preached to them. They all kind of introduced themselves. We had a meal. The Lord's Supper was separated from it, and like it would normally be in an American church today. But they were only moving out of there because of a hassle. Their culture, they didn't have a big problem being in close proximity. They'd been all in the refugee camps. They knew how to be close to each other. Yeah. But yeah, I wonder about what are the legal ramifications of trying to do some of this stuff? Do you promote not, if you're not going to become this corporate identity, do you think people should not file all the, nonprofit paperwork and stuff, or is that not part of the New Testament church dynamics?
Well, I think that is a freedom issue. It's no problem to get a tax identification number from the federal government. It takes everybody 5 minutes. You download it, bing, there it is. Churches do not have to file income tax reports. I mean, that's what churches just don't do that. And so you don't have to do that. You really just need a tax identification number if you're going to open a bank account, or if you're going to, sometimes it's helpful to take up money in a common pool to send to missions, or if you're going to support a pastor, which is not uncommon, then, you got to put that money somewhere. And then if you're an employer as the church, and you're going to, I don't know whether you want to issue him a 1099 or a W-2, depends on how you set it up. But, so no, I'm not opposed to doing that. That's just a hoop you can jump through. The government, our government, doesn't stop us, that I've been able to tell, from doing anything that God has called us to do. And if it ever did, of course, you just don't register, like in China. But no, I think it is helpful to have a corporate account for missions and supporting qualified elders, for sure.
We only have a little time left, so let me segue that so the small churches, part of it is the one another ministry, as you write.
Yeah.
And you just referenced kind of how paying a pastor is part of what most churches do. And when I was reading that chapter, my thoughts went to, as a pastor, you immediately get defensive and think, well, if everybody is kind of contributing to the worship service, are people going to start saying, well, what are we paying this one guy for then? I wonder if part of the system is stacked toward the one guy kind of carrying the load, as it were.
Well, and short answer is I think no, because in 1 Corinthians 14, he's mentioning all the different spiritual gifts. And one of the gifts is, in ESV, it says lesson. And we know there is such a thing, not only as a gift of teaching, but as a gift of pastor-teacher. And so gifted people are not that common in the church. So I don't think you're ever going to replace a pastor. Also, somebody's got to have the time to dedicate to study, spend the hours of in-depth preparation to have a quality lesson each week or whenever. And then on top of that, outside the church meeting, there's the marriage counseling, there's the discipleship, evangelism, seeing people in the hospital. There's big advantages to having a full-time guy, or at least a part-time guy. And there's a difference between paying a man to do a job and releasing a man to do a ministry. So if you got a guy that's really got a heart for the ministry, and he's meets the qualifications for elder, and he's what Paul called those who work hard at preaching and teaching, or the word of the ministry, however that's translated, then to be able to release that guy, it's a blessing to the church, and we need more of them, not less of them. So as long as the pastor understands there's the freedom for the brothers to speak, and that shouldn't be a threat to him in his teaching ministry and all the other stuff he does during the week, that's not a problem. I've been both bivocational and full-time at this since 1983, and it's much better to be full-time than it is bivocational. Let me tell you, it's just a blessing to have that extra time to serve the body of Christ. But most of that time I've been doing New Testament church, and I never ran out of things to do. And so if a guy feels threatened, it's because he's insecure and not really understanding the functioning of the body and how it's supposed to work.
Now, when you say it's uncommon to come across gifted people in the church, there's not going to be so many it becomes unwieldy or kind of disorder and chaos, which is what 1 Corinthians 14 is about avoiding. What about the multitude of people who think that they're gifted?
I was going to say, my job as a teacher, my job as a pastor, is when somebody gets up to speak and it's terrible, I coach them after church to help them understand what is and is not edifying. And, some people just talk too much, and I have to coach them. Don't tell me how to build the clock, just tell me what time it is. And other people are mute, and they got God doing good stuff in their life, and they never say it. And I try to put dynamite under them to get them to talk. And so my job as a coach is a large part on the sidelines. I'm not trying to be the star player. I might be a player coach, but I'm not interested in being the star. I want to get those other guys out on the field with the ball. And so a lot of my job is behind the scenes coaching. And some people are just so terrible. I have to spend a lot of time with them. And related to that, though, Zach, a lot of guys are just not walking with the Lord. And you give them a chance to speak, and they don't speak because God's not doing anything in their lives because they're turned off. And if they do speak, you're sorry they did, because it's obvious they're not walking with the Lord. And so I spent a lot of time doing damage control with those guys too. But, that's just part of it. It's a lot easier to let nobody speak but the trained guy. But God's way is to let these other guys speak, and now my job becomes, okay, guys, this is edifying, this is not edifying. And coaching them, it's always a work in progress. And every time somebody new comes in the church, I kind of have to start all over again with that person to help them get a feel for the things that are edifying and the things that are not. And the other people in the church we have to love each other enough to put up with it when every now and then a guy speaks who really shouldn't have been up there. But as long as they know the elders are dealing with it behind the scenes, most people are pretty tolerant of it. It's certainly not something you'd broadcast.
Yeah, Nathan, you got any thoughts on this stuff? I know that you guys at Greg's church do have people get up and share and speak and stuff. Sometimes we certainly do at my church.
Right.
I know that my buddy Ted, when he was at a church pastored by a rather famous guy here in town, he wrote a very famous book called Why We Love the Church. And there was a whole chapter about how much he hated the freestyle service where anybody could get up and say anything, because it became such a gong show and such a look at me fest. And I guess what you're saying is that the job of the elders is to make sure that doesn't happen, not to reward that when it does, and to direct people away from that and toward lifting up God and edifying the body with what they say and how much they say.
Amen. An edifying meeting doesn't just happen. God gave the church elders for a reason. Well, even the word overseer in the Greek, he's like a quality control guy. He's looking over everything, be sure it goes right. And, first is, we don't let anybody speak unless you're a church member in good standing. So that cuts out a lot of, they say bugs are drawn to the light. So if you got some unhinged people in the community that hear you've got a participatory meeting, they think they've seen truths that John Calvin never saw, and they're going to start a second Reformation right there in your church. Well, not ours, they're not. They don't speak unless you're in good standing, number one. Number two, we do coach them on how to be edifying. Number three, we're not talking about a huge crowd of people. There's no stardom here. You're talking about a fairly small church. Well, see, that removes the lure of America's Got Talent, where you're standing in front of these huge crowds. Well, no, you're not. See, so that removes that, and we know everybody, and we know who the nuts are. You always got nuts, and we work with the nuts, and we love them. And some people, we won't let them speak, and we say, look, brother, until you are able to hold down a job for 6 months, or until you hadn't been drinking for 6 months, or until you hadn't beat your wife for the next 2 years, whatever it is, you're not welcome to speak. And we work with them very closely. So it's a privilege. It's an honor to be able to get up and edify the church with what you say. So we, just like in the Old Testament, you'd bring this perfect sacrifice to the temple. We try to get people to think of what they say in that way, that, okay, they've thought about it. They're presenting an offering to the church and to the Lord through what they say. So there's a decorum and there's a deliberateness about it. We try to discourage the off the cuff, haven't really thought about it comments that people might otherwise make, and we require them to stand up, walk to the front, and get behind the podium to say it. And that little bit of formality cuts out a lot of things that people might say that shouldn't be said, because it requires you to get up there and think about it before you get up there.
So you don't have kind of the fully spontaneous Quaker kind of deal where you're in the round and there's no absolute truth. You have the pulpit still there signifying we're speaking all on the authority of the Word of God, and it'll be weighed by the people, and there's a standard.
Amen. In fact, we have a statement of faith. We go by the First London Baptist Confession of 1644, and we tell people.
I have never come across a church that uses that one.
Well, that's us. Let's do it. Let's do another podcast. I'll tell you why we use that one instead of the second one.
I would absolutely love to do that. I don't know if that could keep Nathan's attention or not, but I'm obsessed with Baptist confessional statements. So that's very interesting. Well, so everything has to fall in line with orthodoxy. You're not going to.
Right.
Have you ever had to stop someone in mid-screed? Sorry, buddy, this is not right?
Yes. In the old days, we weren't wise enough to say you had to be a member. So some people would show up and leap up there, and that was bad. And so, we try not to embarrass people and slam dunk them. If it's just kind of wrong, we'll usually let it slide, or maybe get up when they're done and say something about thank you for sharing. We have a hard time agreeing with everything you said, but we appreciate, your desire. But if it's just somebody's denying the Trinity, we stop them. Yeah. Okay. We in love. Well, in any church, if you let anyone in the pulpit, I mean, I've had people from the Gideons come and speak and thought, oh man, yikes, that was an accidental heresy. So that unless you just guard it like a dog, on a chain, which is so unbiblical to be like autocratic about it. You have to take a chance and trust the Holy Spirit is speaking to and through other people. Yeah. Yeah. We love covers a multitude of sins, and we try to err on the side of graciousness for sure. I flew over a military cemetery one time in Virginia, and those things, they're perfect. There's perfect order in a military cemetery. It's neat rows diagonally this way, that way. Everything's identical. There's perfect order, but there's no life. And I'd rather risk a little disorder and have life than have perfect order and just squelch it and kill all the life out of it,
I like your sermon illustrations. I wish that in talking extemporaneously, you had the kind of dedicated alliteration that you have in your book. Although that's asking a lot.
That's asking a lot, man.
This old boy loves his peas, man.
Well, I get on the roll,
I have one more question for you before we have to let you go, and really thank you for your time. This is all I can tell by Nathan's comments. He's as fascinated by what you're doing as I am. I love the referencing the kind of positive use in the scriptures of paradosis, paradidomi, traditions handed down, from the saints, from the apostles, and so you're saying, if I heard you right, there are things that are prescribed, and then there are things that are described that we ought to want to emulate, even if they're not mandated. And I'm wondering if sharing everything in common, like the earliest church did in Jerusalem, is one of those traditions that must be emulated or should be emulated. And if not, how is it that you kind of draw the line on, what are we going to try to emulate from the early church and what we're not?
Well, you could say the same thing about foot washing, couldn't you?
Sure, yeah.
I think it takes a sophisticated approach to the scriptures, and we try to go with the general consensus of what most people who have studied the Bible or most scholars say was a common practice in the church. For example, plurality of elders seems to be a common practice within a single church, and so that's a pattern. when you look at the communalism of Acts, you only see one church that ever did it. There's no indication that any other church did it. There's also no command to do it, so it's certainly not prescribed. And I would argue that in the example given us in the Jerusalem church, that was a temporary solution to a temporary problem that we should consider following under similar circumstances. But barring those circumstances, there's no reason to do it. And what I mean is, it looks to me like you've got, who knows, 1 or 2 million people in Jerusalem for Passover, Pentecost. Certainly the city swelled to many times its normal size. Pentecost comes, Holy Spirit falls, thousands and thousands of people are suddenly converted. Thousands. Well, now what? They can't go back home to Alexandria and join the local church there because every church leader in the world is in Jerusalem. The only church in the world is in Jerusalem. So what are they going to do? It looks to me like that communalism was in response to the need to pay for all these pilgrims to stay longer in Jerusalem, to learn about Jesus before they went back home to Rome or Alexandria or wherever they came from. So as I see it, it was a temporary and creative solution to a temporary and creative problem. And we should be willing to do the same today. We see the example of sacrificial giving, but I don't see that repeated in the rest of the churches in the New Testament and throughout the Roman Empire because the need was different.
You're not feeling the burn, man?
I beg pardon?
You're not feeling the burn? Bernie Sanders? 2020? It's biblical. What a weird note. What a weird note to part on. I don't know why I went there.
Well, listen, that's all right. If anybody wants to sell their stuff and send it to me, I've got the gift of receiving. So it's all right.
And you got the gift of selling. Where can we get your book? Thank you for comping us copies, so we could be informed when we talk to you. If someone else wants to get a hold of this, is the best place ntrf.org, or do you have it on Amazon? Or
it is on Amazon, but I tell you what, for all your listeners, we'll give them a copy for free if they just send us their address. So go to the website, NTRF, New Testament Reformation Fellowship, ntrf.org. Contact us. That's where you go. And send your name and address, and we'll send you a copy of it.
And there's a lot of teaching on the website, lots of different stuff, all on these topics. So if you're interested, if this piqued your interest, definitely have a look at the new. So it's called the New Testament Reformation Fellowship.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it, and this has been very interesting discussion.
Well, God bless you guys, Zach and Nathan. I appreciate what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to that podcast about the First London Baptist Confession.
Nice. We'll do it, man. We're not even joking.
Good.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you,
Talk to you later.
Okay. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
gentlemen.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Man, Zach, that was a ton of information. Really good. And I'm glad that you took the lead on that. I was relatively silent other than, the time I opened my mouth and looked like a complete idiot. So,
Oh, you did not. Stop it.
But no, I mean, Zach.
In fact, I kind of agree with what you were saying. I wanted to almost kind of cut him off at the pass if he was going to try and shoot down your whole argument with that one fact.
How would you respond to that, Zach? Let me ask you. How would you respond to that?
To what? What you said, or to the whole thing? Well,
to what you said to me. The believers meeting daily and all, and all that stuff. How would you kind of respond to that and work through that? I don't know that we do have more fellowship than they did. I think we have less. I think we have different kinds, and I would like to see more. What I would like to see more of in the church is not necessarily spontaneous elements in worship, although, I mean, if that's your thing, that's great, but spontaneous worship. It seems to me like, Peter's in prison. What happens? All the women in the church gather at Mary's house and pray all night. That's their prayer meeting. Yeah. It just happens. They're together, they're worshiping. That's just what they do. What are they doing? I was just preaching this week on with the passage where
Paul and Barnabas are sent out, and they're in Antioch, and they're together, the elders. What are they doing? They're worshiping. So like I'd like to see a lot of that, and they had that in the early church. I think maybe like what you were saying was we get a lot of this stuff in, it just doesn't take the place of the main worship gathering,
right? Where
you have to have 100 people able to come together and worship, or however many are there.
Yeah. It's interesting talking, and I just, I want to say, because Zach, you and I are probably going to go another few minutes here and just kind of talk about this, Stephen not being online with us anymore. But I appreciate his approach. He said it several times, this isn't something that he looks at as, he looks at this as a, kind of a freedom thing. And I really appreciate that, because I know a lot of people who are like, no, this is wrong and you're doing it wrong. And,
right.
And I really appreciate his attitude about that and his spirit about it. So let me just say that and caveat, things that I'm probably going to be saying is that
in parenthetical, even when he seemed to kind of go way off over the top with don't call that church, when he clarified, meaning, no, I'm not saying they don't have a church. I'm saying that church is more happening at the small group level than so he was. For a minute there, I was like, ooh, what kind of guy do we get on here when he said that? But he walked it back and explained what he meant. So go ahead.
And,
Sorry about that.
So, I appreciate that so much about him. And the dude is very knowledgeable. You can tell that he's done research, that he's done his study. And so, all that stuff out there, tons of respect for him. And actually, I'm thinking back to an episode where we had John Frame on the podcast a few years ago, and I think John Frame,
the smartest man alive.
Yeah,
perhaps.
like I think he would agree with much of what Stephen said. Like if you were to listen to his thoughts on the church and what the church should be, I think he agrees a lot with it. But one of the things that I remember him saying on the podcast, because I remember asking him the question, should we try to go back to that? And his response was, no, God has moved his church in a different direction at this point. That trying to go back to a lot of those things as quote unquote idyllic as they would be, and as much as they were kind of set up as this model, we have to ultimately remember that when Christ, was talking to Peter and he said, upon you I'll build my church, that Christ is the one who's been building and developing his church throughout the years. And so all the movements and the tweaking, and I don't think the church is by any means done. I think it's going to continue to move and do things differently. It's going to develop differently. I'm sorry, but I think it's a huge blessing. Like we've talked about before, John Piper's church and ministry, the fact that you can go on and you have access to so many resources. And the only reason we have access to all those resources is because they had such a large church where they were able to build and develop. Did you catch
Doc and Devo this week? They talked about the strengths and weaknesses of small and large churches, and they said just that, like the number of resources that can come out of a large church and benefit the small churches. It's staggering.
Right. And I think that's, one of the things that we need to keep in mind and remember. I mean, think about Tim Keller and, all the stuff that he's been able to do, being right in downtown Manhattan. And, so yeah, there is, and I grew up in a small church. I mean, I can remember all throughout my high school, there was 120 in our church. And yes, there are great benefits to being in a small church. And I acknowledge that, and so much so that it was very difficult for me to transition into a larger church. Now, thankfully, when we had transitioned into CFC, they were still smaller and growing at the time. There was around 200 people. Now we're over 400. And yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I do not know everyone in the church, not even close to it. Some of these people, I've been going to the church close to 9 years now, and there are still people that I don't know, and they've been in the church as long as I have or longer. But there are groups of people that I have very close connections with, and they are my family. They are the ones that I would go to, and among them is, one Greg Dutcher. Greg is one of my closest friends.
Never heard of him.
I know, right? The slacker. Although we should be having him on next week. Little side note.
Nice.
Right. Should, because haven't we been saying that for the past 6 months? But
coy.
But the things that we are currently able to do in our church, we weren't able to do when we were at 200. We are starting to do live video streams, and we are getting the gospel out to more people at this point because we have the ability to do that. And so, coming from that smaller background and moving to a larger background was difficult. I don't know that, and I think it would be equally difficult now for me to transition back into a smaller setting. Again, I really appreciate, Stephen and, the things that he's doing and saying. I was very silent for most of the time, but a lot of that was because I was pondering the things that he was saying. When someone can get me to shut up and think about the stuff they say, it's a miracle,
I've never done it.
I know, right? But he is such a smart guy, and I absolutely enjoyed listening to him speak on these topics. That being said, and I think you would agree with me, Zach, I don't agree with everything that he said, and so and I'm okay with that. I don't feel like I have to.
Well, I feel like there was, throughout the book especially, there was a lot of kind of all or nothing.
Yeah.
And a lot of and this is just something that's easy to fall into when you're writing and you're already convinced of your own position. There was a lot of making a weak case for something and then assuming that it's, or a case for the possibility of something.
Yeah. And
then assuming that was the case. Why can't just the bread and the cup also look forward to the coming of Jesus?
Right.
He says there's no better symbolism of a meal than a meal. Well, that the meal is symbolizing body and blood. Could we say there's no better symbolism of body and blood than body and blood, and we're going to kill? I mean,
right,
you know what I mean?
Right.
If you take that to other topics,
right,
it doesn't hold up as well. Why can't we do the kind of spontaneous and discourse and dialogue in Sunday school? And
right,
a Wednesday night service, at a Sunday night service, it's still on the Lord's Day.
Right.
What about things like the big Pentecost sermon? He brought that up, but didn't address that this is one guy speaking to many. Now, he'd probably say that was a special meeting and we should have special evangelistic meetings. He talked about Billy Graham and stuff.
Right.
And I really, I guess I got a couple of critiques that I should have brought up with him on the horn to defend himself or answer them. But I think it would do a disservice to our listeners if I didn't mention I find that kind of weird singling out of Constantine as this wrecked the whole church. He's the point at which everything starts to fall apart. It's weirdly affiliated with a lot of the Restorationist churches, and I think it's just it doesn't usually work. Yeah. I mean, he says in the book there weren't really church buildings that were dedicated church buildings till after Constantine. It's not true.
Right.
Throughout the second half of the 3rd century, we see these. He mentions the houses kind of evolving into especially, modified buildings. But then before long, you've got a good number of purpose-built halls for Christian worship.
Right.
Diocletian destroys most of them, but they were built. And the model is after the synagogue, and he doesn't ever mention that either.
Yeah. That
the church, the offices, a lot of this stuff is modeled after the synagogue. They had dedicated buildings that were a little larger in format. They had a litany, even though, yes, Paul and Jesus were able to speak. It's not because anyone could just jump up at any time. It's because they were visiting rabbis.
Right.
And so they were shown that deference and given a chance to say, their stuff. And then one other thing along those same lines is there's a lot in this book or a good deal of like, here's a possible rendering of this Greek word. It works sort of, and so I'm going to stake doctrine on it. Mm-hmm. I find it very fascinating, the notion that just like the rainbow is there, not to remind us of God's covenant, but God will see it and remember his covenant. Right. He builds this whole thing in there of the meal being a reminder for God. I don't think it's way off base, mm-hmm. but the word it's hold on, it's gonna come to me. Anamnesis is that I think that's it. My Greek I'm keeping as sharp as I can, but there's still cobwebs in there. It can mean remembrance, memory, or reminder. Yeah. And he goes on this big thing about how it's my reminder. So if it's his reminder, it's not for us, it's for him. Well, it means memory too, and we're dealing with a genitive here. Remembrance of me. Mm-hmm. It's like condemnation of the devil, right? Is it either the devil's condemnation that he throws at us, or the condemnation it's a little bit, open to interpretation. Right. The notion that in the Lord's Prayer, that could mean, there's an ESV text note that says daily bread might mean bread for tomorrow. Yeah. Right? But every single translation you look at says daily bread, right? So we're going way outside of the walls of the safe harbor. Yeah. When it says submit to elders, it actually means be persuaded by them. Except I looked at 40 translations and they all said submit. Yeah. And they all said obey. So we're going out, little ships should stay close to harbor on this stuff. Yeah. And so, whether it means my reminder or remembering him, if I say my memory, it can mean stuff I've remembered or how I want people to remember me after I'm dead, right? Right. Yep. Maybe it means both. I don't know, but there is danger in saying I can sort of make this work, and then here's a list of people, which he calls professors, I think, in each chapter, and a little clip of each one kind of agreeing with his position, and then kind of the leap to this is the right view on things. Right. But aside from that, for a book that doesn't look like it had a major house going through editing and working through it with him, it's a real well done. Yeah. It's a well done book, and the fact that he's willing to give it to people, and he's not afraid of people reading this thing and us having these discussions like we are. Yep. It's a really cool thing he's doing and giving of himself into it. I hate that this is my time is up here, and I hate that this is ending with me like critiquing this with him not here. That's crummy. So let me just say, the guy had a real kind of intensity and yet a friendliness that was very catchy. Yes. And it made me want to know more about it. And I'd love to sit through some of their worship services. Oh yeah. And this is a dude that I would, we had talked about having him on to discuss, the confessions. I would love to have him on to further discuss this more. I would do that in a heartbeat. And, there are certainly people that we've had on and we've never had on again because, there's kind of been a kind of cool idea, but the execution and talking through on the podcast, this was a guy that, I found myself not really agreeing with terribly, but would love to sit down and have another conversation with him. And so, again, I think this is part of what we should be realizing and understand as brothers and sisters, is that we can disagree on these things, and that's okay, and still think, hey, you know what, Stephen is a really cool dude, and I would love to have him on again and talk with him about other things. He's very knowledgeable about things, and I enjoyed what he had to say. My silence, and I hope the listeners know this by now, my silence on this podcast isn't a statement that I'm holding my tongue. I am deeply invested in what the person's saying, and I truly want to know what their point of view is. And I think the other thing is, not only we agree to disagree and we respect him as a person, mm-hmm. I think without going fully headfirst into this totally different model of church, yes, there is so much to be gleaned here. Yes. And maybe it moves us 40% in that direction. When I read or watched his teaching on the Lord's Supper, there was so much there that I thought, man, even without saying, okay, it's going to be a full meal this week, I was able to bring that to our worship together in the Lord's Supper.
Yep.
I have continually been struggling to get people to wipe the frown off their face.
Yeah.
This is we won, you guys.
Right.
Yes, there's a solemnity to it because of what the price that Christ paid, but it's also looking forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb. If you're not going to be like this, then you know, this is good stuff. And all the participatory worship, it challenges me to make sure more people are involved in sharing their gifts. It's less of a, even in a small church, you can have the show up front.
Yeah.
The whole thing, it didn't convince me. That almost persuaded me to become, one of these early church dynamic adherents.
Right.
But it challenged a lot of my kind of calcified formality.
Yeah.
That we need to break out of it in many ways. And whatever he's got, we need to be able to access that.
Yep.
And his people are probably a great model for us in a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
So yeah, and he's going all over the world teaching this stuff. We missed him because he was in this country and that. And it's clear this is a labor of love and spiritual passion for him.
Yeah.
Not an industry or anything like that. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, just again, a reminder to our listeners, New Testament Church Dynamics, A Leader's Guide to Biblical Growth and Planting by Stephen Atkerson. And if you go to the NTRF, New Testament Reformation Fellowship, and we'll put all the links on there, but if you go there and you drop your name and address, and I'm sure, just kind of let them know that you heard him on These Go to 11, you can pick up a free copy of it, and I highly recommend it. Getting the book. I would recommend getting this book. Even if you weren't getting a free copy of it, I would recommend getting this book because there's a lot of information that you can take and glean from it. But the fact that he's willing to give it away, definitely go on there and pick one up.
Would be a great study for a small group to do together. It'd be great for discussion around this. And even if you come to the conclusion of, well, we're not 100% sold on all of these elements, why not? And making us revisit assumptions is always good.
Yes, absolutely.
And I got to bolt. There's Domino's Pizza waiting for me, which, speaking of things that divide people, some people think it's gross and slimy. I think it's delicious.
Dude, that garlic crust that they have on that thing, so good.
Delicious, yes.
All right, man. Well, this was another really good podcast, Zach, because we don't do anything less on here.
And a long one.
I know, right? It's been a while since we've had one this long. But, Zach, we're going to go ahead and sign off now. We just rocked the Casbah.
These go to 11.